Hey, it's Mike here, and today, eating less meat won't save the planet, according to the YouTube channel What I've Learned, who I've had to respond to several times now. Last time he was like, meat doesn't cause cancer. Of course, I had to respond to that. So his tirade of defending meat consumption continues, and about a dozen of you guys emailed me, and I'm sure his video has about 500,000 views by now. So we're gonna respond. And yes, I'm currently traveling, I'm outside, and so I'm holding the mic, so I'm not gonna be able to make as many dramatic hand movements, and I framed myself in third, so hopefully I can fit some graphics here. We'll see how things go. His video is 26 minutes long. I obviously can't respond to everything, but I'm going to try to respond to the main points. And I will say the thesis of it is, if you live in the US, you don't need to worry about lowering meat consumption because it just has a kind of a small impact. And first of all, just this mentality could be applied to anything not saving the planet. Why quit driving? Why stop using plastic? Why travel in the airplanes less? And of course, as you know, this is an appeal to futility fallacy. Starts by highlighting a few videos with some claims about animal agriculture, like Kurzgesagt, who I've actually responded to in the past, as well as Vox and Cowspiracy, and his response to those is...
But are they really giving us the full story? Don't worry, we'll talk about each of these points in detail.
In order to cover these points, he interviews a animal sciences guy as his expert, and, he claims that he's neutral, but we're gonna let you decide on that.
By the way, Dr. Mittliner says, of course livestock have an environmental impact. In fact, his job is to research ways to reduce livestock's environmental impact.
First subject they really dig into is water.
Do cows really take all our water?
So the water input that people assign to beef includes, and that's the majority, the so-called green water. And the green water is rainwater. That rainwater would fall on that land where the animals graze with cattle present and without cattle present.
Of course, their angle is no, it doesn't matter, with the animal sciences guy saying, rainwater doesn't really count. I will say I'm visiting Colorado right now, and I remember they made it illegal to catch rainwater, and they did that for a reason, because rainwater matters. It's also a resource, and it especially matters when you're talking about land that is irrigated with rainwater naturally. That is a huge resource we have. Point is, we can only produce a limited amount of food with the amount of land that is naturally irrigated that we have in the US, and we're currently using it super inefficiently to raise meat, and we're going to cover land more in a bit, but...
Now, the vast majority of water that goes into a beef animal will go into the beef animal in the form of feed, not in the form of water that they drink, in the form of feed. And guess what happens to that water a few hours after it's ingested? It's urinated out. It's not staying in the animal.
Yes, he just said that. I didn't know whether he was serious, but it appears that, yes, in fact, he does believe that all water that hits a plant is magically imbued into it, and then when it's fed to animals, they're gonna pee it all out. No, obviously, most water isn't absorbed directly by the plant when you water that plant, in the same way that I don't weigh 80,000 pounds from all of the water that I've drank over the last 30 years. But yeah, a lot of water is used for feed, and of course, a lot of that feed is actually harvested dry as well. I don't know why he isn't aware of this, or whether there's something I'm missing.
So that water is not all of a sudden miraculously gone, okay? It is going in and it's coming out.
And he talks about it being peed out and just running down the landscape, but in a lot of cases, it's not that simple. Look to the Ogallala Aquifer, which we've already pumped out a third of for agriculture. That is in the ground. It is not something that we can just sustainably refill easily. This aquifer supplies nearly a third of the US's irrigation water, and from this study, it's probably gonna be about 70% empty by 2060. And the word cattle appears 60 times in this paper because that is the main use for this water, growing corn to feed cattle. And yes, just the cattle that is raised in Kansas alone above this aquifer eats all of the corn that is produced in the area. So we're literally pumping that aquifer to raise meat. Anyway, estimates vary, but if we're going to refill this aquifer once it's dry, it's probably gonna take about 6,000 years. So no, it's not just something you can pee-fill back up. Pee-fill, that's the new word. But think about down the line, maybe if we're having some food insecurity issues in the US, instead of having this massive reserve of water underneath everything, no, we would have drained it so that we could have more beef.
So the real worry we have is overusing our freshwater reserves for irrigation. And 70% of the world's freshwater reserves go to irrigating crops. 53% of the groundwater for crops goes to rice, wheat, and cotton.
Really, that much water goes to that? And this is where I get a little bit frustrated because much of the video is spent actually criticizing applying global numbers or numbers elsewhere to the US. But when you're actually looking at the US, those three crops together make about 19% of irrigated water use. So yeah. However, when you add together animal feed and then corn and soy, which is mostly fed to animals, you're talking about 57% of irrigated water use. So either way you slice it, growing livestock is using a ton of irrigated water, which is super valuable. And like in the case of the Ogallala Aquifer, water usage especially matters where it is not unlimited or you don't have a ton of rainfall, which brings me to California. And of course he has to go after almonds here because they're not meat.
But think about this. 94.5% of Californian almonds water usage is not green water. That's 1,097 liters per quarter pound, almost 10 times more than beef.
So while this animal sciences dude is from California and UC Davis, he doesn't apparently know the chart that was put together by a UC Davis professor, which shows that animal feed has the lion's share of water usage in California, where it does not rain all that much. Yes, forages and alfalfa completely dwarf things like almonds, and California is growing 80% of the world's almonds with that water usage, the same water usage he is criticizing.
Think about that the next time you're ordering an almond milk latte.
Yes, anytime you're eating a vegan plant-based product, be completely ridden with guilt. Nope, to this very credible study, it appears that cow's milk uses more water than almond milk. So yeah, there's lower water choices, but cow's milk is a higher water choice, so just shut up.
Beef is way more nutrient dense, so yeah, 122 liters used to make a quarter pound of beef is not nothing. But you can't compare that to a quarter pound of rice, which only uses 90 liters but provides only 1/5 the protein and much less vitamins and minerals than beef.
He says that meat is more nutrient dense than these various plant products. You can't actually compare it one to one. And here's where I have to nitpick a little bit, because of course when he's comparing beef, he compares it to white rice instead of brown rice. If it was brown rice, for example, they both would have had 14% of the daily value of iron. And it is also worth mentioning, yeah, rice isn't the most nutritious thing in the world, but he has to choose the highest water, lowest nutrition grain to compare. And his main comparison here is protein. So let's just go and compare the environmental impacts of different proteins. And yeah, it appears that in terms of emissions, plant-based proteins destroy here. Legumes are super eco-friendly, with nuts on average being carbon negative per gram of protein made. And while we're talking about emissions, they really hit the main chunk of emissions later on in the video, but toward the beginning of the video, they made some interesting claims, and here they are.
The entire US going vegan would be 2.6%. So if everybody were to do 2.6, if 1/10 of that would do it, then it would be 0.26.
Firstly, without disclosing it at all, he cites a paper, they both cite a paper here, that has no conflicts of interest allegedly, but then you just pop down where these people are from, and yeah, they're from, Animal Science and the Dairy Research Center. So yeah, these are people whose industry and therefore livelihood depend on continuing the consumption of animal products, and a threat to that, the biggest threat to that, is the consumption of plant-based food. So of course, they're going to write things like this to attack it. And having a conflict of interest doesn't mean you're therefore wrong. However, a bunch of really well-written official responses that were published in the same journal make some really good points, like this one, which talks about how for some reason they decide to, in the animal-free scenario, the vegan scenario, feed everybody nearly 5,000 calories worth of grain. Yes, I've talked about this one before because people like to use it against veganism. Apparently these people aren't aware that you don't have to rely on just corn or soy for all nutrients, and that the human diet includes more than that when you're talking about plants. Anyway, that just shows you the caliber of research that they're bringing to the table. There are a lot of problems with these sort of lower estimates of greenhouse gas emissions from livestock that are cited throughout the video, and it's more or less 3 points, I think. And the first one is how they choose a really long global warming potential, 100 years, which, yeah, a lot of people use, but if we're actually concerned about getting things done now, we want to go with a shorter time frame. Number 2, we have the undercounting of methane from livestock, period. And then number 3, we have land use, which is super important. Let's go into detail on all 3 of these, starting with number 1, that global warming potential. Global warming potential is how much a certain gas, like methane, which we're talking about here, warms the planet compared to CO2. And he really bothers me here with the way he represents methane with this chart. Listen to this.
Methane is then released into the air when the cow burps. Then in about 10 or 12 years, it's broken down into water and carbon dioxide. What this means is that the cow is not adding new carbon to the atmosphere.
So methane just goes up, becomes CO2, no worries, about 10 years. Well, one thing he's not saying is how much more powerful than CO2 it is when it is methane. If you're looking at a 20-year global warming potential, we're talking about 86 times as powerful as CO2. If we're talking about a 10-year, we're going even shorter. We're talking about 130 times as powerful as CO2. But do we actually care what happens to the atmosphere in a decade or so? Abso-freaking-lutely. A lot of scientists have, blown the whistle that we really want to prevent irreversible climate change or global warming. That could probably happen, within the next decade, reaching that 1.5 degrees Celsius of temperature rise, something we really don't want to do, so this matters. He pulls up a methane emissions chart for the US and says, yeah, it appears that only 2.7% is coming from these ruminants. So you go, oh yeah, we just never need to worry about this. Let's just keep eating beef. But if we care about what happens in the next 20 or 10 years, we're multiplying that by 2.5 or 4 times. So it's becoming quite relevant. And yes, there is a lot of non-livestock methane, but still livestock is the main source of emissions of methane in the US, worth noting. But now we have to talk about the undercounting of methane, and that is a bottom-up versus top-down counting of methane. I've talked about this in the past, but the idea is just calculating based off single animals doesn't appear to be accurate, because if you take, say, satellite measurements of whole systems, we're seeing that we're undercounting methane in these livestock systems by about 39 to 90%, at least according to NYU professor Matthew Hayek, who says, quote, "This implies that animal emissions in the United States in official reports by the government, such as the US EPA and in numerous peer-reviewed scientific publications, are routinely underestimated." So with all these things considered, where are we starting to land in terms of this pie chart? Well, you start talking about the top-down emissions and the lower global warming potential, and it's based off that range of undercounting of 39 to 90, but then, average that, boom, we're up to about 15% of total emissions from livestock rumination, and it shifts even more when we consider something called the airborne fraction of CO2. The airborne fraction is the amount that actually makes it up into the atmosphere once it is emitted, and a lot of things suck it up, like the ocean absorbs some, the biosphere absorbs some, so 55% of what is emitted doesn't actually make it up, but then when you're looking at something like methane, it's virtually all of it making up because, we don't have trees breathing methane. Now, if you're a super expert, correct me if I'm wrong, I am human, but looking to the equation on global warming potential, it doesn't appear to include this airborne fraction. Instead, it just includes things like the actual properties of gases and then how long they stay in the atmosphere once they are up there. Then the final pie chart would account for that airborne fraction, and boom, we're talking about a pretty big chunk here, and whether it really is this high or somewhere between, this is something we should really be concerned about. And then finally, well, emissions do matter. It's going to determine how quickly we get to that irreversible point of climate damage. But in terms of something that could really help us out, we need to talk about land use, because land use can be used to sequester that carbon, to suck it out of the atmosphere and keep the planet from getting too hot. As you probably know if you watch my videos from the USDA, about a half of the lower 48 land in the United States is used to feed or graze livestock. And so if we're able to use that as a resource to sequester carbon, I've gone through the whole model, I have a whole video on it, responding to general EPA figures, that we'd be able to sequester about 90% of all of our emissions in a vegan scenario where that land is just planted with trees. So I think emissions from livestock are something to really be concerned about. Even if you don't, you're shooting yourself in the foot in terms of some of the biggest solutions we have to actually sequester carbon and fight climate change. Now let's shift gears entirely, touch on another subject, and that is food security.
Now, what about resources? Aren't we wasting so much food on cows that hungry people could eat instead?
In the world, take this, in the world, 84% of all livestock feed across all species, 84% is non-human edible.
So he's saying that 84% of what is fed to livestock is not edible by humans, therefore it's not part of our food supply, blah-de-blah-de-blah. There's a lot wrong with using this figure. First of all, it's dry weight, which doesn't necessarily represent actual energy content or what's going to actually make that cow or other animal gain muscle or whatever that you eat, which is animal flesh. No, this is evident by things like grass and leaves when animals are just out in pasture, they take directly from the industry 150 to 200% as much time to reach slaughter weight as an animal that is grown on grass and then fed grain at a feedlot. And that's because grain is so much higher calories. So you can't just look at dry weight like they are looking at. And yes, it is the fact that animals eat way too much of our food supply. Globally, we're talking about up to half of the world's grain. Even from the paper that they're citing here, quote, about 85% of the world's soybeans are processed annually into soy cake and oil, of which approximately 97% of the meal is further processed into animal feed. Bro, it's not looking good. So going back to that classic Cornell University statistic, yeah, it appears that we're growing enough animal feed in the US to feed every hungry person on the earth in terms of calories, which yes, does matter because it's a difference between these people starving to death or not. I'm going to lightning round a few of these other points in the interest of your time. The first one is land use.
So, do cows really take all our land that we could be using to grow food for people?
Again, we're using half of the US's lower 48 land to graze and feed livestock. I think that matters at least a little bit. Globally, we're talking about 30% of our ice-free land. That's a statistic that they didn't mention.
2/3 of all agricultural lands are marginal. The only food-producing land use for these 2/3 of all agricultural lands are ruminant livestock. The reason why you cannot grow crops there is because it's too rocky, it's too hilly, the soil is not good enough, or there's not enough water. Marginal land.
He says that animals are able to tap this resource, which is marginal land that we just could never be using to grow crops or anything like that. The problem is the definition of marginal land is super subjective and a lot of times just has to do with economics. Like if you can't drive a combine over it because it's too hilly, it's marginal land. So this land in Asia, which is growing a ton of calories, would be marginal land. Or maybe it's just degraded soil that isn't worth planting things into right now. Well, people have dealt with this. Michigan State University, even a conventional way of doing it, talking about crop rotation and building up soil. Quote, build up poor soil using a simple systematic green manure crop rotation. So not even relying on animal manure. Also have to say, it's clear that a lot of land has been marginalized through grazing. I mean, if you look to history, the natural desertification process that was happening in the Sahara was massively accelerated by the use of grazing. We see desertification from grazing all over the place. Like, oops, looks like you can only graze now because we grazed. See how that's annoying?
If you don't put ruminants on that land, it will go to waste.
But will it really go to waste? It appears that we can do things like plant trees that sequester carbon on grazing land, on quote, marginal land. Instead of becoming a methane factory, they become carbon sequestration plants, and a lot of organizations and papers talk about this specifically on marginalized land. And so no, planting trees, sequestering carbon, and saving the planet is not waste.
Speaking of making use of our lands, livestock also contribute a very valuable resource for growing fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, half of all fertilizers used in the world are animal manure.
They also try to kind of paint a picture that we require animal manure in order to fertilize plants, that 50% is manure right now. Well, the reality is that's because we have a situation where we are raising and slaughtering 70 billion land animals a year. We have the poop around, so we use it. Chemical fertilizer is obviously not ideal, but as Michigan State talked about, you can build up soil fertility with green manure, crop rotation. All that nitrogen is coming from legumes anyway, so you can just rotate leguminous crops. Or you can reprocess human poop. Finally, I've already challenged some of their lowball emissions claims, but they do mention one of the FAO figures, 14.5% for total global livestock emissions. Their other one is 18%. Either way, on par with all of the main causes of emissions in the world. But they say you live in the US, don't really care about it. Our emissions are lower, so you should just keep contributing. First of all, if there's an opportunity to make even small changes, you should. If you think that these are small changes, it's again appeal to futility not to do this. Secondly, the US a lot of times dictates what the rest of the world strives to do or eat. And in this case, if we continue to eat as much as we're eating in terms of meat and the rest of the world follows, we're totally screwed in terms of emissions and everything else. And finally, the reason that on these EPA figures it looks like it's so low is because the US just has ridiculously high emissions in all of these other areas. We're leading the world in terms of emissions. We're one of the top emitters. So reduce it wherever you can. Anyway, finally, the video of course just hits on topics where they feel like they can make an argument. Ones they didn't hit on is how Animal agriculture in the US is the leading contributor to dead zones and impaired waterways in the US, and is doing a ton of damage that way. Or just, if we want the planet to survive in terms of humans surviving on the planet, we probably don't want to have more pandemics, and raising animals for meat is probably the biggest threat we have for the next pandemic. Whether it was the pangolin last time, which is up for debate. We know it was some chicken farming in 1918 that caused the most lethal flu in human history. All right, this video is getting long. You get the point. It is still absolutely worth giving up meat in order to be reducing your environmental footprint. You can do it like that, boom. It's even easier than, say, not driving a car for a lot of people. This video is, of course, not just relying on the opinion of an animal scientist, but they're also citing some pretty sketchy animal scientist research there, which has been highly chewed apart. And finally, just looking to those methane emissions, it's concerning. If you care about what's happening in the next 10 or 20 years, that pie chart becomes a very different pie chart, and we want to prevent irreversible climate change. So you can just say, head in the sand, yeah, it's probably really low, or we can go, oh, actually this is a big threat and we need to mitigate it as much as possible. So yes, reducing or eliminating meat consumption is absolutely a part of saving the planet. All right, that's it for today. All right, feel free to let me know down below what you thought about all this. Feel free to like, subscribe, take a look at some of my numbers if you want to be a nerd, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.